Just imagine if you had to make a golf swing without using any hips at all. That'd look pretty strange, right? I don't think you get very good results that way. So if we're going to use the hips, let's make sure we're using them correctly. That's what we're going to do in this video. Many of the swing faults you're going to have, strike, direction, swing shape, can be traced back to what you're doing with your legs and your hips. Backswing, really important. Now we are talking in this video specifically about the irons. It would be a little bit different with the driver. We're not going to cover that too much, but let me know in the comments box if you'd like me to do the same sort of video for driver and show you and share the differences. So this little exercise I call staying in lane. This is all about making sure that we have a good rotation, we're staying fairly centered. And there's going to be kind of two ways that we can do this. So I've got myself a 7-iron. If I took a setup to this golf ball, and Joe, who's holding that camera over there, is going to put two nice lines on the outside of my legs. You can see that they go from the outside of my feet right the way up and basically touch the top of my hips. Now, when I get to the end of my backswing, so when that club is kind of finishing its movement away from the target, away from the golf ball I should say, my hips need to be within those lines. So if you do this, if you video yourself and watch your swing, it would be quite rare to see someone who during the backswing the hips go towards the target. It does happen. If that's you, then you definitely want to work on that, because from there you're going to tend to want to reverse them on the way down and get too much weight in this leg, but that is quite rare. What's more common is to see someone shifting this way through those lines with knee, hip, and what happens is the weight goes far too much to the outside. Now, why this happens, we can have a whole conversation on that. Generally, in my experience, it comes from a history of being told to move your weight onto your back leg or transfer your weight or load up onto your right side. Those ideas, generally in my experience, don't tend to help. So what are we actually looking to do? Well, I said at the start that at the top of the golf swing, we were looking to have your hips within those lines. That's the key checkpoint. You look at someone like Rory McIlroy. What do his hips do? Well, if you put those lines on Rory, as he moves away from the ball, he'd probably shift a little bit. He'd probably break through those lines. But when he gets his left arm to about level with the ground and he's adding in hip turn, he will start to what we call recenter those hips. So when he gets towards the top of his golf swing, he's stayed in his lane. Obviously those two lines are meant to represent a lane. So that's a great way of doing it. I really like that movement. That's one I prefer because I think it really gets some nice energy into the golf swing early. It enables you to shift some pressure, but it's not the only way. If you look at someone like Justin Rose, for example, Justin Rose would have less shift off the ball. His right hip would turn a little bit behind him and he would stay within his lane pretty much for the whole golf swing, the whole backswing, I should say. Whichever one works for you is absolutely fine. So what I'd love you to do, grab a reflection, a mirror, something where you can see yourself. Take the golf club, place it across your shoulders, have a couple of reference points. You could just take a couple of alignment sticks and actually just place them sort of in the ground. I've only got one here, but I'll show you. In a position where they are, you know, pretty close to this hip, and you could place one here and you could just make those rehearsals. Or in front of a mirror, you know, if I was looking in the mirror there, I can make these movements and get instant feedback as to what I'm doing. Staying in lane is brilliant for your irons in terms of ball striking. This is going to represent my levels, okay? Hips turning level is absolutely fine if the ball's up here. If the ball is on the level of your eyes and you're stood up dead straight, then it will be absolutely fine to have the hips turning level. But the golf ball is on the ground. So when the golf ball is on the ground, we have to tip over. And what does that mean? We've got to have angle through the hips. And you can see how I added that tilt in. I got some angle through the hips. So the two checkpoints I'd look for you to have in the backswing is number one, that you're staying in lane. And that number two, as you're doing that, your left hip is lower than your trail hip. Doesn't have to be a huge amount, and it will depend on the golfer and how tall you are and potentially what club you're using, but that's going to be your reference point. Downswing. Now very often, backswing for many golfers, not too bad. They get themselves primed okay. Downswing is when I generally see things kind of going out of sync, going wrong, and there's often two reasons why. We're going to cover those. One of them is to do with shifting towards the target. Many golfers know we've got to do that. You know, we've got to get to the top, we've got to move our weight onto our lead side, and I'll often hear golfers saying that they're trying to bump their hips or push their hips forwards. That's potentially not wrong, but let's think about that in a different way. I'm going to place my club there. If I took a setup to this golf ball, and I just want you to imagine that I'm looking down at a clock face. 12 o'clock would be above the ball. I've got 1, 2, 3, 6 would be behind me, 9 would be over here. If you asked me to bump my hips towards the target, this is obviously just my setup, I would do this. So where are my hips going? They are going to 9 o'clock in this direction here. This alignment stick is moving towards that 9 o'clock on the clock face. That would be me bumping my hips forwards. But we're not bumping them from setup, we're bumping them from the top of the backswing. So what have we got at the top of the backswing? We've got rotation. So now, in terms of my hips, what do my hips think is forwards? Well, they think forwards is now this way, which is sort of more 10 or 11 o'clock because they're on an angle. And this is what many golfers do. They will get to the top and they'll bump their hips and they'll push them towards what they feel is forwards, but forwards with rotation is not always correct. So what you should be doing with your hips is you should be bumping your hips forwards towards 9 o'clock, which actually feels, for many golfers, forwards and back. And that is such an important distinguish to make between the two. Your hips have to move towards this 9 o'clock position. So it's forwards and the left hip is moving backwards. That is incredibly important because that's going to give you that little kind of squatting or settling move that we see almost all of the great players do. Watch your golf swing pop up on video and I almost guarantee that if you put a line on the top of your head and a line on the back of your tailbone, in transition, you will be breaking those lines, coming away from it with the hips, raising through it with the head. And it can often just be because your hips are trying to go forwards. And for them, forwards is over this way. That's the first point. The second point relates to that. I've actually used this word a few times in this video. I've talked about bumping the hips. I actually don't like that as a word because when we look at the swing from face on, let's show you what can often happen when the golfer has that as a concept, an idea. We make our backswing, and then when the golfer tries to think about bumping, we often get this. Left hip pops up too soon. It's higher than the right hip, probably just about. That forces the shoulder up. That forces the head back. I've got far too much tilt through my eyes. I'm going to find it very hard to land the club in the right place. When we look at the patterns of movement from great players, great ball strikers, there's plenty out there that we can look at and study. What we see is that in that first phase of the downswing, the left hip, which is represented obviously by this stick, stays lower than the trail hip. So let me show what that would look like. We've got our backswing where the lead hip is slightly lower, and in transition, it would stay lower for a longer period of time. So what have I got with my hips? They have bumped towards the target, they've gone backwards, and the left hip has stayed lower. That is possibly the move in the golf swing that you need to work on the most, because I see so many issues in this transition phase with the hips not moving correctly. And if the hips don't move correctly, it's just so difficult. You've got literally milliseconds to try and recover it. And very often that recovery is you trying to do different things with your hands, and you might get the odd shot out of 10 that works, but reality is it's not going to be consistent. So let's get those hips working perfectly as we've described. You've got 3 movements. You've got forward, back, and lower. If you can do that, you're going to be in a fantastic position where you can then think about your delivery. Let me go ahead and try and hit one. Not the best strike, but not too bad. You're nearly there. You're nearly at impact. We're on our way down. We've got a perfect downswing position. What do you need to do through impact? And then we're going to share with you that really simple drill which will incorporate all of these movements. Well, this one I call stay on the wall. We've already spoken about how we want some lateral shift. So if you can imagine, at setup, I was stood against we can just use a line, but visually, conceptually, I'd have you visualize a wall that's on the outside of your lead side. As you make your downswing, your left hip would move and basically make contact with that wall. From here, what I would love you to focus on is taking your belt buckle and then pushing that onto the wall and causing it to rise. So I would go lead hip to wall, belt to wall, and I'm staying on the wall. It's really common, I've spoken about this so many times in my videos, it's really common to see a shift across, great delivery position, pressure through this lead side, but as the club goes through, the hips back away from the wall. And it creates some really almost ugly looking body positions, it can often create this swiping across motion where the club exits really left. We can often see the arms separate, the weight gets stuck and the back foot spins, and it can really create some kind of quite wayward ball flights. And you know, very often the golfers who do that look on camera and say, well, I'm shifting to my lead side, that's all pretty good. They're missing the kind of final piece. So if I was to rehearse this, I would go hip to wall, belt to wall, and I'm rising up. I'm pushing up away from the ground, so I'm feeling tall, and when I finish, my belt buckle is in contact with that wall. If I go ahead and do that just in stages at this stage so you can see. So we go here, hit the wall, belt onto the wall. Great strike, only a little swing, but it's going to work perfectly. And that's how I get my hips to go from this delivery position to this really nice extended position here, which gives me the room to get my arms working well, to get my arm structure well, and then to get that really nice high finish. You're then watching your ball fly right into the middle of the green. Right, let's now share with you that drill that's going to incorporate all of those movements. So here's the drill. You're going to do this indoors, and all you need is a wall. Okay, you're going to take the golf club or alignment stick, place it across your shoulders. You can see me over here doing it, and then at the bottom of the screen you can see what I've created, which is a top-down view looking at what the hips do. So think about your trousers. I have got a back pocket on this side, and I've got a back pocket on this side. So when I stand against the wall, my tailbone touches that wall, but this pocket doesn't, and the other pocket doesn't. In my backswing, what I'm looking to do is I always want to stay in contact with the wall throughout this whole drill. But I'm going to take my back pocket on my right side, and I'm going to rotate it onto the wall. So when I make my backswing, my right pocket is on the wall. Then what I need to do is I need to slide it towards the target and remove it from the wall. So I get to a point now where my hips have shifted forwards, my tailbone is in contact with the wall, but neither my trail pocket or my lead pocket are in contact with the wall. As I go through, I'm going to take my lead side pocket and I'm going to move that onto the wall. And as I go through, I maintain contact as well. So a few little points to remember there, but essentially we're going trail pocket onto the wall, slide it forward, remove it, and the lead side pocket goes onto the wall. It's great because you've got two reference points. You've got your right pocket and your left pocket, and you've got the wall as a reference. So you can really think about what rotation. It's going to give you a great sensation and concept for what that good rotation is. You'll feel very clearly if you want to come away from the wall, or maybe you're not rotating enough. Just really, really insightful to work out what the movement is that you currently do, and also what the movement is that you want.